Please note that in this show, you might hear graphic descriptions or language that may not be appropriate for everyone. Listener discretion advised.
Scallywag, scallywag. So there's two meanings. A person, typically a child, who behaves badly, but in an amusingly mischievous rather than harmful way. It's like a rascal. That's Scallywag, son of yours.
Welcome to Parentless Podcast. I am your host, Stephanie Relaford. On this show, we're going to be speaking with others who have experienced the loss of one or both of their parents or parental figures. As we heard in episode 12 with Louisa Velarde, being parentless is like an island, and I don't know how to swim. Thank you for being my life jacket.
Hi, Steph. I'm Liz Gleeson, and I'm on the east coast of Ireland in a little county called Wicklow. I live here with my 4 children, my dog, my cat, and my 4 rats. And I have a grief therapy practice here where I see people on a regular basis supporting them through their grief experience. I'm also a podcast curator. I created the podcast Shapes of Grief, and I developed an online grief education program for psychotherapists, which is also available at shapesofgrief.com.
Who is your person and why are we here?
So we're here to talk about, well, I assumed the name of the podcast, Parentless Podcast, it was about the death of parents. I didn't think of anyone else. And I guess I remember back in March seeing the name of your podcast and thinking, oh, wow, I qualify for that. I'm parentless now. Yeah, my father died 2021 on the 6th of March. He died peacefully at home. It was a long dying process. He'd been ill for a few years. He was 92. And I had moved in with him actually for the last 3 weeks of his life when I knew he was at end of life. So that was a real privilege to accompany him for those weeks. It feels like yesterday and it feels like a lifetime ago. And then my mother died 16 years ago. Quite different circumstances in hospital. I had a very different relationship with her. And I think how we relate to people, how we're attached to them, the nature of our relationship really will determine the shape of our grief afterwards as well. My father's name is Morris Hugh Gleeson.
And your mom's name?
Teresa Gleeson.
Do you say their names very often?
I don't. I hardly ever. Certainly my mother's name, I had to actually think, what's her name? I never say my mother's name. And Dad's a lot less. Actually, I have this lovely little pin. You can see me, your listeners can't, but it's a lovely pin from the Irish Hospice Foundation, a bereavement pin. And someone who used to work there, and I teach there sometimes, gave this to me the other day. And it's so lovely because Dad has been dead for 7 months, but it's weeks, probably months actually, since someone actually mentioned him to me. And it was so nice. I went for a walk with Susan the other day, and at the end of it, she handed me the pin. And it's like, just such a lovely acknowledgement of, I know you're still grieving, or I know this isn't a long time, or I know your life has changed irrevocably this year. Yeah, it's so important to say their names, isn't it? And no, I don't say their names very often at all.
Tell me about your dad.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, like I said, Dad died this year, and it was my first significant loss since becoming a grief therapist, 6 or 7 years ago. And I didn't know how I'd be. It's like, wow, what will this be like? I used to think maybe a decade ago, he was so involved in my life. I used to think, gosh, if anything happened to him, I'd be just so broken. But it's amazing how prepared I was for his death when it did come. Dad had surgery 5 years ago for an aneurysm. And before that surgery, he was quite a capable, able 80-something-year-old, up ladders and using chainsaws to top his trees and baking his apple pies with his garden produce. And yeah, he was a good guy. He wasn't perfect, but he was a good guy and certainly a good father. I'm grateful to have had him. But over the last 5 years, he had become progressively weaker and he had dementia and he never really recovered from that surgery. So it was interesting because I separated 6 years ago, and around that time, my father became ill as well. So it was like losing two pillars from my life, these two men who would have been my go-to people. And that was hard. I think a lot of the anticipatory grief that I felt with Dad, knowing he doesn't have forever, one of these days, one of these illnesses or episodes will get him. I think I didn't recognize the anticipatory grief because I was going through a separation, which, by the way, for me was much harder than the death. People often don't realize that, how difficult that can be. It's another shape of grief, right? So it was only when Dad died, and I guess I felt like I had already processed so much of losing him in anticipation of losing him, that I realized actually how much his slow decline had been impacting me for quite a number of years, and that it was a gradual letting go. And like every time he'd be in hospital, I'd wonder, is this it? Will this be the time? Are these our last weeks? Every time I would leave the hospital, I'd say to myself, are we good? Are you good with everything? Is there anything you need to say? And then I was also really conscious of making memories, imagining, just feeling and imprinting, if you like, what his hand felt like in mine, what his hands looked like, really sort of taking photographic images of a smile between us or a glint in his eye. Like he was so rude and inappropriate and immature. But it was, I guess I met him in those places. He was fun to be around. I did a lot of smiling around Dad.
With it being so recent for your dad at this time, how do you feel like his passing has affected your life?
Yeah, and I guess that's still unfolding, Steph. As I said, I'm separated, so I'm pretty much solo parenting 4 children. There's not a whole lot of time for contemplation, and it was also difficult minding an older, sick parent and having that responsibility. Now, he did have carers. I'm so grateful for that, I'm so grateful to him that he had put money aside for his care for when he was older. I love that advanced planning, and we, as myself and my brothers, all agreed that that's absolutely what that money should be used for, and he was very keen to stay in his own home. So we used his money to provide him with 24-hour care so that he could be in his own home, and he had full-time carers for about 3 years who were amazing, and mostly Filipino women, some Irish, but they were just absolutely a godsend to our family. And I've gone completely off track now, but yeah, I was saying, before he relented to the carers, and he just wasn't really able to say no anymore, because for years he would fire anyone we brought into the house to help him. It was hard, it was a responsibility. I was home alone with 4 young children, and regularly having to throw them into the back of the car in their pajamas to go and tend to him if he'd had a fall or wasn't answering his phone, or if something had gone pear-shaped. So I never resented it. I never felt like it was a burden, but it was, it was difficult. And also with the dementia, it was like a slow loss of him. I think Pauline Boss calls that ambiguous loss, where they're physically present, but emotionally absent or mentally absent. And Dad was sometimes emotionally absent, sometimes mentally absent. Sometimes you get glimpses of the old him. But that was quite hard to be with. But it was very gradual. So, I never felt like I was in deep, sort of fresh grief around that. But it was just, like I say, with anticipatory grief, a gradual, slow decline. I was very prepared for his death. I had anticipated his death. When I knew, okay, this is end of life, this really looks like it, I contacted all my clients and I said, my father's dying and I want to be with him. And then I will be taking bereavement leave. So I'm gone for a month here, probably. Let me know if you want me to give you somebody else's number to support you at the moment. And so I moved in with Dad for 3 weeks till he died. And then I took a month, pretty much, bereavement leave following his death. His death was, we had so many, like, the funny moments and holy moments and sad moments and tender moments over that time. There's none of it I regret. One of the days he did that Lazarus moment of sitting up in bed and wanting to get out. And I remember jumping into the bed beside him and just sort of holding him, and he fell asleep in my arms, and his carer had walked into the room and taken a picture on her phone. And it's just the most beautiful picture. Like, I'll always really, really treasure it. There was other moments where I just played really gentle music and had a candle lighting, and I sat there on my laptop doing some work beside him, or just sitting in the moment listening to the music. There was other moments where, even when he hadn't eaten for a week and he hadn't drank for 6 or 7 days, like just water on the tongue. Like, by the way, it's a total myth that people can't live more than 3 days without water. Like, this can go on for quite a long time, and I think it's good for people to know. But one of his carers had come in. She was an Irish woman, and she said, and Dad had his eyes closed for maybe 24 hours and was very unresponsive. And she had said, "Maurice, do you want a sponge with water on it just on your lips?" And she was going to do it anyway, assuming he wasn't going to answer. But through this coma or this deep unconsciousness, he said, "If you can spare it." He was cracking jokes literally 4 days before he died. And we kind of looked bewildered at each other and just both burst out laughing. And it's like, yeah, the wit is there, literally on his deathbed. He's still making jokes, And then the dying, the sort of act of dying, if you like, was quite a long time as well. It went on for, I suppose, like really 10 days from when he last ate and drank to when he died. And that's, again, I was quite prepared for it, but I wasn't fully prepared either. I thought he'll definitely die today. He'll definitely die today. And then he didn't. And it was like the next day, he'll die. Like, today is the day. And he didn't. And it's like so much dying happens before they're dead. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really important to know. It's like he was almost like a corpse when he actually died. He was already quite rigid and cold and almost kind of solid, but his heart was still beating. And I didn't know that could kind of happen. It's I say it not to be morbid, but to help someone who might be accompanying their parent who's dying. This is the reality of it. He was very comfortable. There was no pain. There was no agitation. But it really struck me how much dying happens. You think they're so nearly dead already, but yet there's more and more and more. in his case, his heart just kept beating while everything else was stopping.
And for you as a mom, how do you feel like losing your parents have affected your parenting? Have you changed anything with that?
I think the biggest thing for me is thinking about longevity and thinking about, before I used to think, I'd love to lose weight because I want to look better. And then it turned into, well, I'd love to lose weight because I'd like to be more healthy. And now it's like, I want to stay well and healthy because I don't want my kids to have to mind me. I want to be available to them and to myself for as long as possible. So, maybe there's something around that in terms of priorities or something. But how has it changed how I parent? I don't think it has, Steph, to be honest. I don't think it's changed how I parent. Maybe being more conscious of, fostering their independence. And I mean, I've always talked about grief and loss and death and, here in the family with my kids. But yeah, maybe just a fostering of more independence as opposed to indulging them so much or getting more of a balance with that. Even from the practical side of things, like I don't have a will. I need to put a will in place. I need to organize my papers. I mean, hopefully they won't need that for another few decades yet, but we never know. And you don't want to wait for serious illness to happen before, and then to have the burden of having to organize your administrative things. So that's one thing I'm really conscious of is, oh my gosh, I need to get everything in order and make sure that should something happen to me, that the kids will have an easy ride and everything's in place from that perspective. That's my responsibility now rather than a nightmare for them should something happen. That's something I'm more aware of, Steph. So Dad died March 6th. It was a Saturday, 2021. And it was in the middle of one of our lockdowns. So this was when people weren't circulating at all. And, here we have suddenly, yes, you can have a funeral, but only 10 of you can be there. So it was interesting just trying to navigate that with family, whose kids get to go, whose don't. Thankfully, a word in the priest's ear, and he did let all the grandchildren in. But I struggled with, I had said to my friends and my kid's dad, I had said to him, don't come, you'll just be outside. And I didn't want to, sort of have him feeling unincluded, if you like. And I'd obviously said to my friends, or I just assumed as well, that everybody would follow the restrictions and would be respectful and would stay home. And there was actually something really nice in not having to navigate too many other people at that moment, I actually think intimate funerals are the way to go. I didn't need crowds of people there. And it meant that the focus for me was just about writing a good eulogy, picking a nice suit, and being really in the process of burying him and doing the rituals around death that we have in Ireland. So actually that was a surprise that not to have a lot of people around really suited me. I really liked that, even though I'm quite an extrovert. But other members of my family did have lots of people there, and I wasn't prepared for that. And I found that really jarring to see sisters-in-laws and brothers and their husbands and their wives and their kids and their pets and their grannies and granddads. And actually it was like, whose needs are being met here? Mm-hmm. Why? It made me really think, how do we do funerals? Why do we do them this way? Whose needs are being met here? You know, when I go to someone else's funeral, why am I going? Is it to be seen to do the right thing? Is it to be seen to be a good friend? Or is there a genuine supportive role that I can play? I would love someone to do some research around that, because I think it would uncover all sorts of shit if they did. You know, I'd even going to the funeral home, one of my brothers had decided he wasn't going to go. I said, I definitely want to go. I want to see Dad in his suit and in his coffin. And, you know, then my other two brothers said they would come. And I was like in my jeans and a sweatshirt and looking awful after having not slept properly for 3 weeks. And when I got there, there was 20 members of my in-laws family all standing outside. And again, it was like, why are they here? There's a lockdown. Who are you here for? Whose need is this, you know? Yeah, there's something about that really didn't sit with me. And I think at that point, I kind of handed over who the funeral was for. And it was almost like, this is a performance for other people, because it was being recorded. And that was very good for my brother and sister-in-law in the States and my two nieces who weren't able to be there because of the lockdown. I'm glad they were able to join, but it was like, it was so intrusive. Who's watching? Are any of my clients watching? Are, you know, who's out there? So it was like, yeah, just this performance with some members of family having people there, others having no one there. It was just, for me, there was a dissonance to it, you know. So the real precious moments are the ones sitting beside his bed when it was just me and him. That was my funeral. That was my saying goodbye. The actual ritual was for somebody else, but it didn't feel like it was for me or my children.
I like that you brought up the camera situation, because, you know, I think for people outside of it, it's like, oh, well, that's nice. You have access. Everybody has access to it. But I didn't realize that aspect of it, of like, oh, who is out there watching? You're right, because they do post it just publicly, right?
Yeah. And then afterwards, and who isn't there watching? You know, it's this, depending on our personality and our attachment style, it either really matters to us or it doesn't, that people show up for us, you know? And so for me, like, there was some friends that just didn't log on, that just weren't there. And that really, I was really mad at them. I was like, that's not good enough. You know, to text a week after going, hey, how are you? Did you have a funeral? It's like, that's not good enough, you know? Okay, you can't attend because of the pandemic, but you can still show up. You know, how, you know, which is why I have all these questions about funerals. Why do we go there? Is because it's expected of us, because during a pandemic, at the first opportunity to not have to bother, there are people who just didn't bother, you know? And then versus the ones who texted going, I'm here, I'm watching, I'm with you. You know, as soon as it was over, texting saying, that was so beautiful, you spoke so beautifully, you know, that meant the world to me, you know. And there's a very close friend, I won't say who, but I was so cross with her because she had said she was watching and had texted later in the day to say, you know, well done. And then when I spoke with her the next day, she's like, oh yeah, I watched the replay after my yoga class. And I was like, that's not okay. You're one of my closest friends. You should have been there online supporting me with, you know, a virtual hand on my back. So yeah, all these layers that come in, and thankfully I'm mature enough to be able to tell my friends when they've let me down and say it in a way that I can own my own feelings around it. And that, you know, my friends are good enough to be able to hear that. But yeah, it does raise a broader question of how we support and how we show up when we're not seen.
Did your dad have any sayings or you said he made jokes and all kinds of things. Is there like a few phrases or jokes that you remember that really come to mind when you think of him?
Yeah, it's funny. My niece was over here 2 weeks ago. She was born and raised in California, and she lives in Berlin now, but she had just arrived in Berlin when the pandemic hit. So I haven't seen her for 2 years, and she gave me a hug at the airport. She's like, "You're the first family member I've hugged in 2 years, you know." But anyway, she was here just for a few days. I had said to her, "Come over and see his house." But while it's as you remember it, you know, it's going to change. And anyway, on her last day, she had wanted to go to Dad's grave, her grandfather. And so I had brought her there, and my three sons were there as well. And, you know, we were just looking at the stone going, gosh, we need to get that engraved, you know, because it just has my mum's engraving on it. And we were like, just that myself, my niece and my three sons were like, yeah, what would be good? And we were sort of coming up with some things. He had some Latin sayings that none of us understood, but when we Googled them, it was like, "Don't let the bastards grind you down," or all these things that he'd come out with. But my son, Oshin, who's 14, he said, "Here lies the biggest scallywag of them all." And I don't even know what scallywag means, but Dad said it a lot. He called everybody a scallywag. And I hope it's not offensive. I don't even know what it means, to be honest. I'm sure there's some historical meaning, but we laughed at that because everyone was called a scallywag. And when the kids were little, you know, they'd call him a scallywag. But he was kind of edgy as well. Like, he'd tickle and make fun and be joking, but then he wouldn't know when to stop, you know? So he was by no means perfect, but he was good-humored and he didn't bear grudges. He was able to just let things go. He loved his garden, actually. Him in his red check shirt out with his chainsaw and his hedge clippers. And he planted strawberries, raspberries, gooseberries, rhubarb, plums, apples, pears. Much more vegetables and fruit than flowers, you know. But he was very proud of that garden. He was nearly 50 when I was born, so was my mother. So as a little child, I remember spending time just pottering around the garden and digging ponds. And, you know, I liked to just be around him. And he was a DIY expert, but that is total rubbish. He just didn't like to spend money on anything. So he tried to do everything himself, and he converted our attic, you know. So here, like when everyone just keeps popping out of children because there was no contraception and the Catholic Church was ruling the country, and suddenly your 3-bed house needs another 6 bedrooms. You know, you converted the garage into a bedroom, or you converted the attic into a bedroom, and he converted our attic into another bedroom, which he started when I was about 5, and I think finally finished when I was 17. So that was like 2 or 3 hours up hammering nails in the attic every night for years. But I would go there and hand him the nails and watch what was going on. And yeah, he liked to be busy, put himself into his home in that way.
Are you handy at all?
Yes, I am actually. Myself and my ex-husband, that was a kind of a joke between us. You know, there'd be a leaking kitchen sink and he'd be like, "Call a man." I'd be like, "Pass me my toolbox." Yeah, like I remember my parents asking me, "What would you like for Christmas?" when I was in my 20s, and it was like always a ladder, a jigsaw, some tool, some electric tool. I certainly had my father's gene in that way. I've decorated my whole house, wallpapered it, painted it myself. I've laid floorboards. I would hang all the shelves. They're not all straight, but I've done it. I love being able to do things. So, you know, as a woman home alone now, I don't remember the last time I called someone to do a job. I was like, okay, I'm going to figure this out. I've taken apart my tumble dryer. I've taken apart my washing machine. Yeah, I hate feeling incapable.
Do you garden?
I love my garden. Yeah, I love my garden. I don't spend as much time in it as I'd like to, but I do have, if I swivel, you can see in the back, I've loads of plants there. And if I swivel around this way, there's tons of plants, all around the house. I absolutely love green and life and plants. I wish I had more time at it, but that's for another decade.
Anything I try to grow dies, so you're putting some time in somewhere. You're doing good.
Actually, I think the trick with plants is the more neglect, the better.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard, please consider sharing the show with a friend or rating and reviewing wherever you're listening right now. This will help get the word out about the show, and if one person can be helped by listening to someone's story here, that is amazing. If you would like to share your story with me, you can visit the website at www.backhomemedia.com/parentlesspodcast. You can also email me at parentlesspodcast@gmail.com. Another way to get a hold of me is to find me on Instagram or Facebook, also at Parentless Podcast. And lastly, if you're a phone person, please leave me a voicemail at 623-396-6069. If you love the show and you'd like to help with any special projects that might go on at Parentless Podcast or just be privy to some special extras, go ahead and visit patreon.com/parentlesspodcast.
Yeah, so my mom, her name was Teresa Hart, and she died 16 years ago. I always know exactly the years because it was just after my daughter was born. My daughter was just 3 months old. And that's it's really interesting because, in my grief studies, I have a master's in bereavement studies. One thing I learned was from John Bowlby and Colin Murray Parks that sometimes the more difficult the attachment, the more difficult the grief. So, with my father, certainly in latter years, I had a really nice attachment to him. And that, for me, really helps the grief, ironically, because it's like clean. It's just sadness. There's no regret, if you like. Whereas with my mother, I did not have a good attachment with her at all. Maybe I had too many expectations of what a mother should be, or watched too many Hollywood movies where there was these perfect women making organic hummus. And, that's what I thought a mother is there to be available 24/7 to feed her children and clothe them and keep them warm and protect them from everything. I think, now that I'm a mother on my own of 4 kids, it's like, oh my God, my expectations were so high and this mothering lark is so difficult, and the expectations on us as mothers and women is nuts, and I actually feel very angry about that. So it makes me sort of reframe a little of my expectations I had for my mother. But she was nearly 50 years older than me. That's a huge generational gap. She was a similar age to some of my friends' grandparents. And then not just her age in years, but like her background, the system she came from, she was the youngest of 10 children. So her mother was born in 1800 and something. She was practically a Victorian, and the egg that I came from was made in my grandmother's womb. So if you look at it like that, I'm essentially a relic. But I say that just to understand the context, because context is so important, So I grew up in the 70s in Dublin, a very Catholic country where there wouldn't have been any contraception, very little choice. The law when my mother got married, which would have been around 1960, I think, was that women, once they're married, can't work anymore. So she had to give up her job. Talk about a highway to hell. Let's take away, your income. Let's take away your independence. Let's take away where you find meaning and purpose in your life. Let's throw you into a marriage without any sex education, without any contraception. And no wonder so many women in Ireland in the 60s, 70s and 80s were just at home on Valium going, what the heck is happening to me? So by the time I came along, my mother had already had 4 children and then a gap. So she pretty much thought I was the menopause. But she would have shared with me in later years how she only ever wanted 2 children. But there wasn't an understanding or access to information. Like the Catholic Church would have banned any sort of information, you know. So yeah, I just think it's important to put the context on this, you know. So here we have someone who's exhausted, literally enslaved at home. You know, when I was a kid, we had a manual washing machine. Like imagine 4 boys all playing soccer and rugby, and you're trying to wash their clothes by yourself in a manual washing tub in the middle of the kitchen floor. Like, it's prehistoric. Like, I think I'd have gone crazy too, you know. And I say that, you know, most sincerely. She was not the healthiest of people. She definitely had mental health issues. We'd have labels and names for it now. Sometimes I do find myself going, maybe she was the sane one living in an insane society, you know, and she was very much a slave to the Catholic Church and its rules. And I guess as a kid, I came out kind of questioning everything. You know, who is this place? And, you know, it felt very dissonant with me, you know, as I was growing up. The teachings, the rules, some of the stuff she would say just did not feel right. So very early on, I just didn't trust my parenting, if you like, and didn't trust the rules that were being imposed on me or the rules they wanted me to follow. I suppose primarily around the Catholic Church and even society. It was a time where, what will the neighbours think? Don't talk about that. And none of that felt right to me. And I suppose, you know, as a young person, I felt let down that this is the mother I got, you know. I feel sorry saying that, but that's the truth. I used to fantasize that I'd find out I was adopted and Annie Lennox was my mother and she'd come and bring me on tour with her. And so I didn't have a close relationship with her. I got on fine with her, but she was difficult. And whenever she'd be in a mood, like there was definitely a trauma response, I was quite scared of her. Only because we didn't do emotion at home, and every now and again she'd explode and it literally felt like, you know, a threat to my life. So when she died, I don't remember being really sad, but I do remember it affecting me deeply in that I had nightmares for about 3 years, really disturbing nightmares. I actually had a nightmare about her 2 nights ago, which is amazing. I dreamt that her body was in a coffin in my living room, and I was saying to my brother and my kids, God, could we just do something about that already? You know, and the lid was off it and you could see her, and it was like, wow. So that difficult relationship is still there in my psyche. I mean, she had some lovely points to her also, but I think where there's any kind of developmental trauma or difficult attachment, sadly, we're kind of wired to be hypervigilant and look out for those things rather than the positive attributes that someone has.
Your first child was 3 months old when your mom passed away?
That's right.
Did anything change with your thinking towards your mom when you had your child?
You know, I feel like I didn't have a chance to get there, Steph, you know, because Leah was only 3 months old. But, you know, just before Leah was born, I remember coming into the house one day, and because I think when we're pregnant, we are drawn to the care of our parents. We mightn't be doing it consciously, but I look back and I go, yeah, I was dropping into them a lot and sitting and having a cup of tea. And I suppose part of me was looking for reassurance or regulation or company. And I remember coming in one day and she was in a dreadful mood. And anyway, without going into it all, she was really pissed that I'd been talking to a neighbour, and the neighbour had seen that I was pregnant because I was not married. So, after her banging around for a while, I was like, what's going on? What's wrong today? And she literally said, get that illegitimate bump away from my neighbors. No, stop flaunting that illegitimate bump in front of my neighbors. So that was tough, but in one way, it sort of validated for me what I'd always felt and thought, that this is just an insane system that we're all living under, the Catholic Church, because at that point I knew my baby was not illegitimate, and this beautiful bump and what it was going to produce was the best thing that had ever happened to me. So to have my mother put me down like that was just a really overt display of invalidation, if you like, which validated my feelings towards her. And then also a couple of weeks later, she was very cross with me breastfeeding and didn't want that to be done in front of anyone and go into a dark back room, So at that point I was like, okay, this is nuts. This is just nuts. And then she died. She died very, very soon after that. She went into hospital for a blood test and never came out. She died 5 weeks later. Once Leah was born, she adored her. She adored her, and she would just sit holding her. And I'd sort of collapse and sleep on the sofa and maybe wake up an hour later. And she was still just sitting there staring at her and loving her and adoring her. And so there's a regret there that what might have changed or what healing might have happened had she not died so suddenly, or so soon, I should say. And yeah, having a baby with a dying parent was hard, But Leah, she was just such a little Buddha baby. She's a 16-year-old fabulous kid now, but she was so easy and she got into a routine really quickly. So I was able to put her down at 8 o'clock at night and then drive 30 minutes to the hospital. And I knew I'd have till at least 2 or 3 a.m. before she'd need a feed. So for the 5 weeks, I kind of made that my zone. That was my time that I would go into the hospital. And my mother died during that time zone. She died at midnight on the 24th of August. So I was with her, it was during my shift. I was able to alert the rest of the family and tell them, I think this is going to be soon. I think it's coming. Yeah, it was a long dying, but a gentle enough death when it did happen.
How do you feel about the fact that you were the one that was there with her?
Yeah, again, glad, really glad. For me, it's just so important to step right up to these things, to face death, to watch it, to look at it, to engage with it. It's when we don't know things or avoid things that it can cause real suffering, I think. So that was my strategy then. It was my strategy with Dad. It's like, okay, I'm going to really face this and really show up and really be present. And, the night she died, I sang to her. I remember holding her hand and just that sort of marveling at life and death. I remember holding her hand and looking at the color in the veins and trying to imagine, realizing she's alive now and soon she won't be. And this is a precious moment. I remember moments like that. And when I was 16, I had taught myself guitar, and the first song I learned was Eric Clapton's Wonderful Tonight. And she often used to say, "Oh, will you play that? Will you play Wonderful Tonight?" So I sang, and you can hear I have such a croaky voice. I was singing Wonderful Tonight to her, and as I joked in a blog article I wrote, if that didn't kill her, nothing would. But I do remember saying to her, there was a storm outside, and saying, "This is a really good night to let go. You've done enough." Giving her permission. You've done enough. We're all good. We're going to be fine. It's okay to go. The same with Dad, but he was just a stubborn git and wouldn't. He was like, I'll go in my own good time.
I think that's super interesting that you were looking at her hands, and then in your dad's death, you made sure to take that time with his hands. Her death probably would have helped prepare you to be more aware during his, maybe?
Yeah, I think the work I do, Steph, often, like as a grief therapist here in Ireland, like the people who come to see me are not the people who've had a normal grief response. Research tells us that most people can manage their grief with support and information from family, friends, communities, rituals, and that it's the minority who need extra help. Like, not everybody needs extra help. It's about 40% of the bereaved need something more, like a voluntary group or a counsellor or psychotherapist who's grief informed, or therapy for prolonged grief disorder. So the people who I see are that 40%. They're not the people having a normal adaptive response to loss. So often it's because they've misinterpreted something around the dying process, or regretted something around the dying process, or missed the dying process, or it's happened suddenly or shockingly, and, they're trying to process it. So I think, that has certainly coloured how I would respond to death. And then also just, death is such a part of life. Death is such a part of life, and we live in a death-denying society, and I like to do things against the grain of the common societal rules, because I think they're wrong a lot of the time. I think we need to bring birth and death back into our communities and into our homes and out of hospitals, and I think we need to talk about so much more than we talk about, and normalize. I mean, we're all going to be born, we're all going to die. Why do we pretend that's not going to happen? And then why are we shocked when someone dies? Of course, there are times where it is shocking, when we're not expecting it. But I think part of living well is knowing that there's a finish point. This is not going to go on forever. Knowing there's a finish point and using that to colour how we live our lives.
Had you started your work and your schooling when your mom passed away?
No, I hadn't. I was a drama therapist. So I worked with groups, mostly groups, doing drama therapy. I hadn't started my work, but I mean, the interest was always there. I know I owned the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. And, I think having had the mother I did, right, with poor attachment, I want to stop making it about her, but, I was not very attached as a young child. So that led me to always be seeking, yearning. Why do I not feel good? Why do I feel unsafe in the world? Why do I have some practices that are bad for me? I would have struggled with addiction when I was younger, and still do with, certain things now. So I was always seeking answers to why I was the way I was. And I think most of us do that at some degree, some level. There's nothing special about that. But I think when we're facing a hardship or there's a pain, we're pushed to do that sooner than maybe others are. And I do remember as quite a young woman, like maybe 16, finding a self-help bookstore and just going, oh my God. And I've said this before, but opening up Scott Peck's book, The Road Less Traveled. And I think the first line in it is, life is hard. And it was like this revelation. It was like, oh my God, it's not just me. I'm not the only one who thinks that life is hard. And genuinely, it was so validating. I'd never heard that from anyone. I'd never seen that. Like, I grew up with the Waltons, Little House on the Prairie, the Brady Bunch. Difficult things didn't happen. Or if they did, you were surrounded by 20 people who could support and help you. So, I think you just don't drop into grief work or drop into psychology or psychotherapy. It's because you have an interest in understanding yourself and the world. And for me, that means everything, you know. That means how we are as humans. It's very broad and very deep, the whole field. So I think I started early with an interest in psychology and humanity. And the grief work was an extension of that.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know if experiencing your mother's death was if that kind of put you into, of course, you had the interest before, but I didn't know if that was kind of the catalyst to get you going there.
No, not at all. If anything was a catalyst, maybe it was my separation. That I knew that was going to come down the line, and I knew it was going to be devastating. And a little bit of, how could I prepare? There's going to be a lot of grief. This is really sad.
So sorry, you knew you were going to be separated before you even started your grief work?
Yes, I knew I did not want to stay in my marriage.
Okay, so that would have been years, right? I mean, because schooling takes for a long time.
Yeah, that was probably 2 or 3 years before I did my master's in bereavement studies. Mm-hmm. This was percolating. So if anything, that could have been a catalyst. But, I think a lot of people are doing grief work from a personal loss. And I think it's really important to get lots of experiences out there and shared and different perspectives. But I think it's also important that we are grief educated as well. I recognize that the experience I had with my mother was very personal to me and those set of circumstances and our relationship, and that my relationship with my father was a whole different type of loss and had a whole different meaning and a whole different response. I know that if something was to happen, one of my family, I would have a whole other set of responses to that loss. But I also know, and if my dad's death has done anything for me, it's just confirmed what the research says. Dr. George Bonanno in Columbia University, 60% of people can cope fine after a loss. And I think that's really important, because when we've had a difficult time or a traumatic loss or an untimely loss or a loss when we're young, we can just feel the devastation of it. And then we're viewing grief and loss through a very myopic lens, through our own personal experience. And we can't have a personal experience and then make it a universal truth. That's dangerous. So I'm so glad I've done the education I did, which was a 2 years master's, to really fully understand. Like, I will never say grief is X or grief is Y. It's grief can be this way and grief can be that way. It's okay to not be okay. And it's okay to be okay. And it's okay to swing between the two. Like, there are so many different types of grief responses. And I think it's really important that we get that message out. Because I had a friend phone me actually last week, and she said, can we go for a walk? And her dad died 6 weeks ago. And we're walking down the street, and she turned to me and she said, I'm okay. What's wrong? It's because we can get a little bit too enthusiastic with our grief awareness campaigns of how brutal it is. We forget that most people will be okay after a loss. They'll manage. It won't derail them.
So what would you say now that your spiritual belief, like we talk about parents, some people say, oh, well, they're looking down on me, they're in a better place. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
But if someone wants to believe that, I will absolutely not correct them. That's their truth. It's where they have relocated someone, but it's not my truth. So as a psychotherapist working with someone who believes their loved one is in heaven and that's where they are, I will not take that away from them. If that's their belief, that's certainly not my job, and it would be unethical. Regarding spirituality, like as a young child, I would have said I was quite spiritual, but I think we've butchered spirituality. The societal way of looking at spirituality, it's very much in the wellness industry. It's become an industry. And now when people say to me, oh, I'm very spiritual, I'm not religious, but I'm very spiritual, I run a mile. It's like, get me away from this person who's half asleep still. Sorry, and that sounds probably really arrogant. I don't know, spirituality for me is just in being a good person, being a kind person to, particularly those closest to me, my children. It is going for a walk and noticing the way the moon lands on the sea and knowing that something infinitely powerful, more powerful than me, has created that. But in what way, I don't know. I don't know is the answer. I do feel awe from time to time. I do wonder. But I think, you're parenting kids, like Maslow's pyramid of, food, shelter, sex, whatever way it goes up. And then at the top, it's self-enlightenment. Or I kind of feel like before I had kids, not that I was enlightened or at the top of the pyramid, but I certainly had a lot more time to live a contemplative life. I can't even say the word. I would have read spiritual texts and been interested in learning from the Buddhists and, would have spent time with myself, even just in communion with myself in a forest. But, as each child was born, I slid back down the side of Maslow's pyramid to, what am I going to give them for dinner? And all of those things have taken over. But it's funny, I'm just in from a hike with a friend actually up in a forest today. And we were talking about this because I've just started a PhD. And it's going to be in the area of grief education. But I was saying to her, I really want to do something that's nourishing for me. And actually, the field of death and spirituality really calls me. Like the work of Joan Halifax, the work of Francis Weller. There's other great minds and great hearts that are looking at death and dying from a spiritual perspective that I have not explored enough. So I think I would like to steer my PhD somehow in that direction because I recognize the need for it, Steph. It's not in my life enough, that spiritual hunger, But it's there, it's latent in me. I think I find it in the garden.
With that, because some people feel like they see signs, they believe in signs. Do you have any signs, or what are your thoughts on that?
It's so funny because I don't believe that at all. I believe we find what we're looking for. Whatever it is we're looking for, we will see it.
We find what we're looking for.
So we have to be really careful what we're looking for, If we're looking for the friends who didn't show up at the funeral, we'll find them. And if we're looking for the people who were there, we'll find them too. So we absolutely find what we're looking for. But having said that, I'm just having a little shiver down my spine here now. Again, as a psychotherapist with clients, life is all about finding meaning, and it's so personal. And if that's where someone finds meaning, that's where someone finds meaning. It's important. But I don't do that. Having said that, about 6 weeks ago, I was in my dad's garden and the plums were ripe and ready to be picked. And so I got a basket and I'm picking these plums, and there's this fat old shaggy robin sitting looking at me, and I'm like, oh, how quaint. Dead dad, robin on the bench. And I'm being really sarcastic, but that bloody robin followed me all over the garden, to the point where it was sitting on the edge of the basket that I was filling. And I was looking at it going, is it you? Now they say every garden has a robin, so maybe it's just convenient, but I get why people would think that. And I get how that could be so comforting, whether it be a feather or a robin or a sunrise. But I do think we find what we're looking for. And I think that's the act of relocation and grief. We look for them. They're dead, but where are they? We look for them. And if we find them, good for you. If you find them, good for you. Because it's so much more heartwarming to find them in a feather or a robin or a butterfly than it is to be cynical, But having said that, in one of my last podcast interviews with Christine Carlson, she shares an amazing story of her husband, Richard, who died on a plane. He wrote the book, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. And he died on a plane. She wasn't with him. Her girls weren't with him. And 2 years later, she's on a plane flying from, I think, California to Washington State or something. And she really wants to talk to the man beside her, but he's busy with his face in a laptop. And she's this really strong urge of, I need to speak with this man. So as they were getting ready to land, and everyone was told to put away their tables and close their laptops. As soon as he closed his laptop, she kind of jumped in and said, "So, are you on business? Are you doing some work?" And he said, "Yeah, sorry for not engaging. Would have loved to chat to you, but I have a deadline." And he said, "What about you? I see you've got a laptop." And she said, "Yeah, well, I'm always working. I'm a writer." And he said, "Anything I'd know?" And she said, "Well, you probably would know the book my husband wrote, Don't Sweat the Small Stuff." And she said the guy's face just drained of blood. And she said, "What? Have you read it? Did you know him?" And he just said, "Was he on a plane 2 years ago to New York? Did he die on a plane to New York?" And she's like, "Yeah." And he, "What? Did you know him? What?" And he said, "I was sitting right behind him on that plane." And she said, "I always wanted to know who was there in his last moments." And he said, "I often thought about contacting you just to say he was okay." He died straight away. So here we are, two random strangers sitting on a plane, sharing that story 2 years after a death. I assume she didn't make it up. I'm sure she didn't. So that's where we go. Maybe there is a little bit of magic out there that we just don't know yet.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of things that are like undeniably, it shouldn't have happened, or just how does that happen? So I think the things that need to happen for us, they happen. Yeah, there's really no explanation though. That is amazing. So when you said that he died on a plane, I assumed that something like happened to the plane, but obviously that was just
no. He had a heart attack
incident.
or something. Yeah, he had a heart attack on the plane.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is an amazing story.
Yeah.
Well, I hope that a lot of people want to go listen to that episode on your Shapes of Grief podcast, because that sounds very goosebumpy. Well, Liz, I don't want to keep you too long. We have got a lot of good information out of you. I'm going to look into your program and see kind of what that entails. And so I'll be really excited to check that out. I appreciate you. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your parents here with us.
Thank you so much, Steph. It's been an honor. Thank you for your patience and your amazing listening ability.
Parentless Podcast is recorded in Phoenix, Arizona. Find us on social media and most major podcast platforms. Music provided by Colin Lococo and the Revolving Birds. Studio and editing provided by Back Home Media and Ian Relaford. Check out one of the many shows on our network. I am your host, Stephanie Relaford.